Well, hang on to your seats. We're going to do about 1,000 years of monastic development in one paragraph. About the year 300, 350, there were some folks who went out to the Egyptian desert for the purpose of becoming closer to God. The world forgetting, and by the world forgot is the way they are commonly characterized. Many lived alone. They were hermits. A few lived together and ate meals together, and they were communal. We remember in the New Testament there was a story of the rich young ruler, and Jesus said to him, "If you want to follow me, go sell all you have and give it to the poor." And while the rich young ruler turned back, there were a few devout people who decided that they wanted to actually give it a try. And that was the beginning of this community. Well, sort of fast forward to about the year 600, and we're now in Europe, and we're at the time of Benedict. And Benedict, otherwise known as Saint Benedict, from whence we get the term Benedictine nuns and brothers, and also the Benedictine rule, he set up a plan because it had gotten a little chaotic out there in the desert. So they thought, we need a written way of life. And the Benedictine rule became established. And communities, mainly of men, would live together following this rule. And they would farm, and they would pray, and that was about all they had time for. You remember when we talked about the windows and the development of agriculture, but about the year one, and at the time of Benedict, the farmers were still digging with a stick. It might have been a big stick with a special purpose, but it was wood. So about the year 1000, the iron tip plow was invented. And so now, instead of it taking one farmer to feed 4 people, about one farmer could feed about 10 people, which meant, number one, that these monks had a lot more time for praying, and they got way more elaborate. And the other was that they got rich because they had lands. And so they were living together in their enclave, like on big farms. But the other thing the development in agriculture did was that it now meant, excuse me, it now meant that just like it had increased wealth for the monks, it had increased wealth for people in general, and that's when you have the beginning of people who don't have to be farmers. They can be merchants, or they can be craftspeople. And there was a building of wealth. And as that was going on, some of these people who now had a little more leisure time said, you know, we would like to get closer to God too. Because before, I think you really didn't have much time for praying or your religious or spiritual life. And so there developed, if you will, a third wave of monastic people, and these were the preaching orders. And they were devoting themselves to meeting the needs of these people in towns that now had a bit more time for their spiritual life. One group of preachers was the Dominicans, but the other really well-known one was the Franciscans, who were followed by the name of Francis of Assisi, who had founded the order. Now, once again, when you're talking about something that was founded maybe 800 years ago, there have been a lot of ups and downs, so I'm not talking so much about the specifics, but rather some of the general ideas of this spiritual movement that began with the preachers, because these preachers, and they called themselves the Little Brothers, devoted their time to the common people, to the poor and to those folks in the cities. I'm not being critical of that earlier era, but these folks were living often on their own agricultural estates, so they were a little slower to get involved with the people in the town. Well, the Franciscan spirit had many characteristics that changed things in how people thought of their life and connection with God. First off, they affirmed the idea of simplicity. And if you think about it, when someone says, we really need to make it more simple, that's in a certain way a critique that they think maybe things have gotten a little complex. And it was interesting that these preachers, these little brothers, were at first not clergy at all. They pursued lady poverty. And again, that may suggest that others were pursuing riches more than they should. They also emphasized the idea that we're all in this together. And the song that we sang to begin worship, All Creatures of Our God and King, which is a musical setting of Psalm 148, which we read responsively, makes the point that all living things are intertwined, that it's not like we're over here and they're over there. We're all in this together because we were all created by God. All living things are created by God. And that may have been sort of a critique of those who were off in their own little corner, seeking their own spirituality. The Franciscan spirit was evangelical, and that word has had a tough history. But what it really means is that the evangelical spirit, the gospel spirit, means that it reaches out to everybody. It's not just for a few over here, but it really is for everyone. And the fact that they devoted themselves to going around and preaching to the people. And I think part of the story of Francis preaching to the birds was that Francis was an equal opportunity preacher. He didn't sort you out and decide whether it was worthwhile to talk to you. He'd talk to anybody because he wanted them to know the good news of Christ. The Franciscans also affirmed the idea that actions speak louder than words. But the way Francis expressed it was, preach always. When necessary, use words. You got to think on that one. Preach always, but when necessary, use words. And that may have been a critique of fancy pants scholars, who knows? Humor. There are a lot of Francis jokes. I don't know that we have time for them today, but the humor really, I think, was a critique of those who took themselves too seriously. There was a brother Juniper who kept getting in trouble by giving away his clothing because he had read in the Sermon on the Mount that if somebody asked you for your cloak, give him your cloak and your underclothes also. So the story was that Juniper would come back naked, and they had to make a special rule to say, you can't give away your clothes. So the story is that Juniper was out on the road one day, and this guy would ask him, and he said, well, I can't give you my clothes, but if you'll just tear it right here, you can have the bottom half of my garment. So that Juniper invented the first clerical miniskirt, because this guy ripped and had this whole thing that had come from the bottom so he could cover himself up. And they said to Francis, "What are we going to do with this juniper?" Francis said, "I wish I had an entire forest of such junipers." Anyway, sorry. And the final thing was that there was in the Franciscan spirit a lot of warmth and love, which maybe even that story goes to show. And maybe that was a critique of those who were taking themselves far too seriously and were all het up about the rules. So if you will, simplicity, poverty, all creatures of our God and King, evangelical, preach always when necessary, use words, humor, warmth, and love. These are all characteristics which are associated with the Franciscan spirit, which is alive even today and has really permeated our Christian culture. You know, Francis is portrayed in little garden statues preaching to the birds, and I'm sure this derives from a genuine love for animals, as those who were created by God just as humans are. He invented the manger scene, as I talked about with the guys, to make the point that Christ came first to the humble animals, which I think is pretty fancy theological footwork. And the additional power is found in the notion that God loves and cares for the little ones. I see that spirit as reflecting the teaching of Jesus when Jesus says, "God knows when a sparrow falls," or the song that Maureen sang a few weeks back, "If God's eye is on the sparrow, then I know he watches me." I think that is part of the underpinning of this garden statue, Francis. If God's eye is on the sparrow, then certainly God watches me. If animals deserve love and respect as God's creature, then it is pretty hard to justify being cruel to people. I remember at the library I worked at one point, I opened this old book that had been given to the library, and it was a book published by the Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And the front piece was a beautiful manger scene in the spirit of Francis. And just as a historical footnote, the SPCA was effective in getting laws passed against cruelty to animals. And when in the beginning of the 20th century, they were working on how we might have laws to prevent the domestic abuse of women and the abuse of children, the argument, part of the argument that was used is that if we have laws to say that you have to treat animals decently, then certainly it ought to be possible to create laws that you need to treat your wife and your children decently. And actually that prevailed, that was historically how those laws developed. So what is the takeaway of this looking at the Franciscan spirit today? And I think one of the big things is the Franciscan spirit in the church is really helpful when it's time to reboot and try things in a new way, in a new and changed environment and circumstance. And when the critique is done with warmth and humor and charm and stories, it goes down a lot easier. It's a lot more effective than in your face. And I think that Pope Francis really put his finger in a brilliant way on the need for this spirit at our moment and time in the 21st century. And I don't know if you remember this kind of inside baseball, but during the last part of Benedict's era in Rome, that they were calling American women's religious orders on the carpet for a kind of an inquisition, and there was a struggle and they were butting heads. And I got to tell you, when the church begins to fight with nuns, the church is going to lose, because somehow they always prevail. But I think Franciscan spirituality helps us in the church to get out of a corner that we have painted ourselves into sometimes, when we've gotten just a bit too het up with ourselves, that this is a spirit that can help us kind of move into a new way. I think another takeaway is that Franciscan spirituality is really made to order for our moment in the 21st century, when we are learning that we must live in harmony with our environment and not think that we can separate ourselves from our environment and simply exploit it. Brother sun and sister moon, flowing water and fire. If we can achieve an understanding through spirituality that we are part of the family of creation made by God, then that we are brothers and sisters with nature and not above it or dismissed from it, then it is easier for us to take appropriate action to make things better. And when they're better for all of us. We all win. And this spirituality can be the bedrock of an improved policy in our world. And finally, blessing animals is a little boffo. I had to look that word up to make sure I was using it, but it's kind of a good-hearted humor. I think it's a reflection of the idea that actions speak louder than words. Preach always when necessary. Use words. If we can bless animals, then we're certainly ready to bless everyone as well. And I think the spirit of the blessing of the animals is a little bit like the do-it-yourself Christmas pageant that we've done here under the leadership of Pastor Craig in the last several years. It is a kind of doing things with action and with humor that have a deeper spiritual significance. Preach always, when necessary, use words. It's a little like a hug and a kiss, and we know that's more controversial today than other times, but it's irreducible to words alone. Somehow a hug is different than talking about a hug, yet really powerful. So in the spirit of St. Francis, let us enjoy this day.